Now think about the things you hear students say. Do you ever hear them say, and you can put your hand up if you want to agree or disagree, do you ever hear students say, why do we need to learn that? What are we doing? Or what's the point anyway? So the first thing you can do is to make sure students understand why they should be listening to you in the first place. When students can see the relevance of what they need to listen to, they are more likely to be motivated and committed to the listening task. For example, if students were learning to write instructions, you could talk about their experiences using Google Maps or building Lego from the instructions that came in the packet. Another thing that's really important is to help them connect to the topic and connect it to something they already know, because the more connections students can make to what they are listening to, the more likely they are to remember it. One way for you to think about it is that if this lecture today was about neuroscience, then most of you, I am guessing, would have very little to connect it to, and therefore it would be incredibly hard to remember. So that's what you need to do to get students ready to listen. So now I'd like you to think about the listening you did today. Think about what the purpose was. So why were some of the reasons you listened today? So what was the purpose or the intent? And write that in the chat box, and we'll find out about the kind of listening that you did today. So I'll give you a little while to start writing that in. It always takes a little while just for you to think about the answer and then type it, and then they all start coming in thick and fast. So I'll read some examples, and when they start overlapping, then we'll stop. So Sharon writes, to clarify some information or instructions. Robin writes, to ensure that I supervised NAPLAN correctly. Yes. Carolyn writes, to know what my role and tasks were. Helen says instructions for an art task. Karen says to gather important information. Raylene says to learn a new skill. Georgina says to find out why a child was upset. Trudy says to understand the content. Carolyn says for meetings, directions, instructions. Debbie says to make sure it was relevant. And it goes on and on. So it's very evident from what you're telling me that you had lots of different purposes for listening today. And that certainly is the most important starting point, to know why you are listening to something so you can then respond appropriately. I'm sure from your comments you would agree that listening is an important skill that we use daily to connect with others and to build our social relationships, and of course for learning at school. Listening is taught across all the content areas as part of the National Literacy Progression, and it's also addressed in the Australian English curriculum from Foundation to Year 10 in the literacy strand called Interacting with Others. There are so many steps in what is covered in listening that I didn't list them today, but active listening does get a mention. And I would be curious to see any comments about whether you have observed active listening being explicitly taught to the students you work with. Now I'd like you to imagine you were able to play back a video from today. So just take a moment, let that video run through your head. How much time did you spend talking? How much time did you spend listening? Were there times when you fell into the trap of talking too much? Or maybe you answered your own questions? Or did you finish sentences for some people because you were impatient? Students spend a lot of their school day listening, and one of the most effective ways you can help students become better listeners is by modeling active listening with students and with colleagues. The purpose of active listening is to understand and remember what is being communicated. There are 3 active listening skills that we need to use to do this. We need to pay attention, we need to give feedback, and we need to respond appropriately.